All right, so I've got 30 minutes, and what I thought I'd do is tell you guys a little bit about our story. And it starts with this idea of being on a high-performing organization, and then how we went overseas and had to learn some pretty valuable lessons, and then how that would be applied that back to helping organizations like yourselves. And then I'm going to focus specifically on trust, and how you build trust both organizationally and from a leadership perspective individually between people that you interact with on a daily basis. All right? My background is, I was a son of a military officer, and we bounced around a lot as a kid. And so from a very early age, I was put into teams, whether I was any good at the sport or not, and said, well, you're living in a new area, you got to join a team. The only rule was you can't quit the team, even if you hate the sport. And that was because they wanted you to commit to something bigger than yourself. So my identity was very much wrapped up in being a part of groups. And so I went on to become a Navy SEAL because I saw that as the biggest opportunity to kind of continue serving my country, because that was important to my heritage and background. But also, I wanted to be part of something that I considered to be high performing. And I wasn't good enough to play sports at a very high level, at least not the ones that actually paid money. And so I thought this was a good way to basically make a living at the same time and have fun doing it. When I joined, it was pre-9/11, so it was a very different environment than the one we kind of went into. But very quickly after our first deployment, I came back, and all of a sudden the World Trade Center happened, and then everything fundamentally shifted for a lot of us. The next 10 years was this journey where we had this massive transformation that took place that was primarily being driven by an adversary who was leveraging technology to do disruptive things. And it was very disorienting. So if you think about this, from my level, I started off sort of as a junior level officer who was leading relatively small units overseas. And what would happen is you'd go overseas, you would do the job, oftentimes you engage with the enemy, you'd have great success tactically, right? Every single time you engage, almost without exception, you'd have success. Then you would come home, you do your typical, what we call after-action reviews, assess what went well, what went bad, train the next group, and then you would repeat. And so we were going back and back and back and forth. And what we started to notice after second, third, fourth deployments was that the situation wasn't getting any better. In fact, it was probably getting worse. So it didn't really make sense because you're having success every day doing your thing, and everyone behind you feels like they're having success, yet collectively on the aggregate it was getting worse. And at the senior levels, what was happening is they were seeing these groups fighting basically individual battles all around, in this case the globe, 17 different countries we were dispersed to. And on the aggregate, they saw in the gaps and seams something was changing. And so there was, in 2004, a small group of us got together and we started talking about, well, what was it that was fundamentally different? What were we going to learn through this experience, and how were we going to take those lessons and bring them back to society to hopefully improve it? Now, this isn't a unique conversation. We think this conversation has happened over the generations, certainly in this country, from a long time ago. And the thought was, inevitably, people serve during times and meet. They learn things in that service, and they bring it back to hopefully make the things around them better. So the question really started to seed around 2004 was, what was the defining lesson? And the key thing that sort of started to manifest was the fact that fundamentally the organization that we were trained in, and the management and leadership styles that we were leveraging were antiquated. They weren't obsolete necessarily, they were just incomplete. Meaning we thought we understood how to engage and have success, and we were getting positive reinforcement from that based on our engagements, yet on an aggregate level it wasn't really working. And the reason why is because we were trained sort of classically to solve simple and complicated problems. So what does that mean? It means in the military, typically if you had large organizations and you could mass them at a point of concentration, you could have decisive effects. Right? So if you're, think of this as centers of gravity, and if you could basically capture that part of the market, then you're going to have overwhelming success. Well, the reality was that had changed fundamentally. The individual had gained tremendous influence and power because everything had gone to social and mobile. And so because of that, their ability to learn, communicate, collaborate, influence, think of that from a consumer standpoint, but also for our case on the battlefield, was disproportionate. And all of a sudden, individuals were having outweighed impacts on larger enterprises. In fact, the fact that we were large made us bureaucratic and made us effectively slow. So think of the large organization like the music industry being disrupted by Napster. It was a very similar dynamic is what it felt like over there. Like if we went up to them head to head in a market, we would win. But in the aggregate, we were basically death by 1,000 cuts. And so we had to find how to do something differently. And really what it came down was how we would communicate and learn to be different. And so we went back to our core roots, right? So if you think about what makes a high-performing team, I'm going to ask you guys this question now. What are the key characteristics that have to exist in a high-performing team? What do you guys think? So trust between team members. What else? Collaboration. Can you expand on that? What does that mean?
All parts. Everyone has a skill set. You want to employ. Everyone has a skill set. You want to employ everyone as best as possible.
Okay. What else?
Continuous learning.
Continuous learning. Yep. Communication. Yeah.
Respect. Respect.
Respect. Okay.
Emotional safety.
Emotional safety. Expand on that, please.
So if something so people feel safe sharing things that they're feeling, so you can use those things to learn from. Yes.
Okay, that's great.
Absence of fear of failure.
Say it again.
Absence of fear of failure.
Absence of fear of failure. Yep. Okay. In the back of the couches. Yeah.
Common direction and goal.
Common direction and goal. Okay.
Clear, measurable mission.
Clear, measurable mission. Anything else? So you guys nailed it. I mean, those are the fundamentals that have to exist in a high-performing small team. And the common denominator with all of the organizations that we're involved in, to understand our background, and, I grew up in a special operations community. We were part of, in this case, I was a Navy SEAL. But I was part of a larger apparatus. And the larger apparatus included Army and Air Force and Marines, and also included a lot of agencies like the CIA, the State Department, FBI. So you might think, well, we're all military, we all have a common mission, we kind of follow rules, we all get along. It couldn't be farther from the truth. Even within our own special operations units, like the SEALs hated Delta Force. Still do this day. And Delta Force hated the SEALs, right? In fact, our networks weren't able to even communicate with each other. We couldn't even email each other because the idea that we would share and collaborate was potentially like a bad thing somehow. And then if you compare that to like the CIA, the State Department, it was, again, even a much bigger fundamental change, right? So the State Department in the United States is focused on diplomatic relationships that are enduring with foreign countries. The military, in this case special operations role, was to go into these places and basically blow things up and remove people from the battlefield. So it doesn't really help when you're trying to establish good enduring relationships, right? CIA's responsibility was to establish a strategic network of influencers that could collect information, or assets that could collect information to provide intelligence back to the United States. So they're asking people to lie or steal or cheat their countries to basically provide us information. We then go in and operate on that intelligence, and what do you think happens to that asset if you leverage the intelligence they use? Well, eventually they get burned pretty quickly and compromised. So there's significant gaps and differences between how we operate. But the one thing we had in common was we all thought of ourselves as pretty good. And we'd all been on a part of a small unit that had been selected and trained and assessed, probably like most of the people in this room. And so we went back to our fundamentals and said, what were the key capabilities that needed to exist if you're going to be successful in an organization? Right? And specifically what we were looking for was how to be agile, how to be adaptive. Because what we realized that in most complex environments, different than complicated or even simple problem sets environments, you have to be able to emerge effectively in real time as the situation changes. Right? So if you guys think about agile or Scrum principles to product development, it's the same thing. You're taking feedback so you can adapt and adjust your priorities and then basically resprint again. And so you've got iterative progress through time-bound loops. Well, the same thing. For us, I couldn't tell you how we were going to be successful going into an engagement with the enemy. Sorry, I couldn't tell you how we were going to engage the enemy, but I'd tell you we're going to be successful because I had a lot of confidence that our fundamentals were superior and that in the moment we could speed up the decision-making process to give ourselves a decisive advantage. So we said, now how do we do this at scale? That was the question. So we went back to the fundamentals. So I believe if you're going to try to create a high-performing team, there's really two things that really matter. And if you don't have these two things, nothing else really counts. So the first is trust. So we're going to spend a lot more time on trust, so I won't talk about it now. The second is this idea of common purpose. And you guys talked about it now, which basically means you have to have a common set of goals and objectives, and you have to align your team against those. If you're a small group and you're playing for your own individual glory, you're likely not going to have success at scale. And the hardest thing to do in environments that are changing fast is maintain alignment. When you're small, it's not as tough because you tend to work in a room like this where you're collaborative and open and sharing a lot, so you can kind of maintain that alignment, but that becomes critically important. And if you don't have these two capability sets, then I don't think anything else really matters. I would kind of do full stop and figure out how to get this, especially if you're at a small team level. Now, once you're doing these well, there's two other capabilities that manifest, though, sort of naturally. And this was sort of the aha moment for us when we were trying to figure out how to use the scale, which is what you guys talked about. First and foremost, people feel empowered. They know the roles and responsibilities. They can make decisions at their local level. They feel like there's a strong safety net. They feel like they can fail and be rewarded for the failure, assuming it's not legal, moral, ethical reasons that they failed. But you can basically move at the speed necessary to do your job, right? If you think about all the small teams you've been in, you typically know your role, and you basically execute within that without having to ask a lot of permission for stuff. And the second thing is you have this concept that we call shared consciousness. And this was the big sort of aha moment. And as we've worked with organizations over the last 7 years, helping them implement some of these processes and changes, we realized that this had the largest correlation to organizations being adaptive or agile at scale than the other three. In fact, they all sort of interrelated. But shared consciousness, simply put, is this emergent intelligence that's created when you have a high density of interaction between teammates. Right, so we talked about being open and collaborative and sharing. When you do that at high degrees of fidelity, the collective understands and knows things that otherwise wouldn't, and therefore then has the context and the ability to make better decisions at their localized level. Right, easy to do on small teams, especially if you have trust and common purpose. Hard to do at scale. And so our challenge was figuring out how to scale that on a level. Right, so what we did is we centralized a lot of our communication and collaboration mechanisms, right? In our case, we had a 17,000 person task force spread across 27 countries. And we synchronized this task force on a daily basis through a discipline operating process that we call the Keystone Forum, where we basically identified the key interdependencies that existed in the system, meaning the key things that the collective groups cared about that were related, and we gave constant updates around those items. And then we tried to share real-time learnings. What we were trying to replicate was effectively what the enemy was doing on YouTube. Right, so if the enemy wanted to basically do something disruptive, they could take a bomb, make it at a home, house make goods, and videotape this whole thing, right? A 5-minute little video. Then they could pack it into a car and drive it into a market and explode and detonate a bomb and have a decisive effect. Then they would, more importantly, tape the response the coalition forces would have and how they react to that. And then they would upload that to YouTube and then show that whole 10 or 15-minute clip that you could watch in its full glory across 500 million people effectively in real time. And so now what would happen is if you were 99.9% of the world that saw it would be very disgruntled, so that's horrible, awful. But 0.001% who were also pissed off or said, wow, this person just kind of gave the man, I think I can replicate that at my level. And so we started seeing these different tactics and techniques popping up randomly all around the battlefield. That's the rate they were learning. Now compare that to how our bureaucracy was learning. If I went onto a mission and I had something decisive happen, let's say something bad happened, and I came back and I wrote up an after-action review, a post-mortem, whatever you want to call it, it would go up a chain of command. Hopefully it would get validated by some senior leader. It would then move over to some training command where it would be institutionalized into doctrine. It would then train the next group of people going out, and maybe 18 months later it would show up as a new capability to the battlefield. So we have a massive dichotomy of how you're learning. And so we had to find a way to basically centralize those learnings through a daily synchronization so that we could have the context and the awareness to be able to make decisions faster. Okay? All right, so I'm going to spend some time talking about trust because that's what I was asked to focus on. So how do we define trust? What does trust mean to you guys? What does it mean to trust? What do we think?
Ownership, and so if you say you're going to do something, do it.
Okay, ownership, do something. Okay, what else?
Putting teams interest, healthy balance.
Putting the team's interests in your teammates ahead of yourself, okay.
Not flaking out.
Not flaking out, okay. What else?
Telling the truth.
Telling the truth, okay. When you trust somebody, what does it feel like?
Safe.
Safe, what else? Do you care about them? Okay. What do you care about with them? What types of things do you value most in that relationship?
Honesty.
Okay, honesty, integrity. So we break trust into two categories. This concept of benevolence, which is the idea when you establish an emotional connection with someone through a lot of constant engagement interactions, you care about them substantively as a person, right? You want to see them be successful, right? Past experience, emotional bonds, you have empathy, affiliation, understanding with them. So this is really kind of walking in their shoes, understanding them, knowing their strengths and weaknesses. For me, as a Navy SEAL in my unit, I knew when I was a junior officer, my 14 or 17 guys, I knew everything about them. I knew their strengths, I knew their weaknesses, I knew their family situation, I knew their financial situation. So I could see and watch them walking down at middle of the night, look at their silhouette, and I understood what they were thinking, what they were feeling in that moment. And we could have entire conversations through looks and nods, right? We had ultimate trust between each other, right? So that was kind of benevolence. I wanted to see them be successful. Competence is most of what I heard you guys talk about, which is the idea that when you give somebody a task, they do it to standard, right? If I pass you the ball, you catch it. If I give you a piece of code to write, it comes back, effectively implemented, right? And usually for me, this was if I go in the door and go right, I know for a fact the person behind me is going to go left because they have to do that or I'm compromised in this objective. Right? So competence and benevolence are the two key aspects of trust. And so when you're trying to basically establish and build that with each other, you have to think of both things in parallel. It's not just about making sure they're good at what they do and having confidence in their ability to do that and earning that over time. It's also caring about them as people. And I think you'll see a strong correlation between improvement when you focus on both and not just one. So what happens when trust breaks? Right? And how do you actually break trust between people? Well, here's a couple of things. This is a long list. I'm not going to read it off for you guys. But these are various things that we see out there that people do on a consistent basis that typically erodes trust in an organization. Anybody want to talk about any one of these things they've seen or experienced? All of them? Yeah? Which one resonates for you guys?
I'd say not responding to another's inappropriate behavior.
Yeah, there's an old parable, right? You walk by and you see something going on, but you see it is wrong and you tolerate it, and this became the new standard, right? So you sort of have to take action against it. But a lot of that happening today, I think, in the larger dialogue, which is a really positive thing. People are starting to speak up and feel more comfortable about having conversations about things that are clearly wrong, right? But it's sort of everyone's responsibility, not just managers and leaders. Right? Everybody has to do that. What else? Okay, so how do you repair broken trust? Spend a little bit of time on this. So I like to think of this in 3 A's. First, you got to admit, apologize, and ask. Right? Really what you're trying to show here is demonstrate some form of active listening. Right? That you actually care fundamentally about what the other person feels, because it may not even make sense to you in the moment why trust has been eroded. So you have to basically get in their shoes and understand their perspective. Oftentimes, people will be perceived to have irrational behavior or outputs associated with things. But if you spend time in their shoes, usually it makes sense. That's my experience. Most people are actually rational actors, believe it or not. Right? Especially when you come from widely different cultures or experiences. Sometimes it's hard to understand and relate. So it's important you find a way to get in their shoes, and it starts by being a really good listener. And so those 3 A's are critical for that. Right? I also talk about usually when you feel like trust has been eroded, you tend to pull back. At least that's my experience. People tend to pull back and disengage because they're worried or they're saying, well, I'll just give them space. I think that's usually actually the absolute worst instinct. It's sort of like trying to do anything in really athletics. You actually want to lean in. You're probably going to have a better experience by leaning into the situation and trying to engage by pulling back and out. Obviously within reason. Right? Ask questions, avoid statements, share information, and demonstrate some empathy that you understand the key aspects of this. Right? And the bottom line is trust is evolutionary. It's not revolutionary. There aren't like one things that fix it. In fact, you can do 10 to 15 actions, and typically one, it takes about 7 or 10 to basically prove or build trust back, again, once it's been done or been broken. Right? So how do you repair it? These are the days when someone else has broken your trust. Right? So how do you start the conversation when someone yourself has broken trust? Here's some key things. Same with the 3 A's, but also you got to have to allow some of these feelings to sort of emerge and surface through the conversations. Right? Kind of basically establish that safe environment and say it's okay to have some failure and make them aware. And obviously it's important that you try to figure out how to forgive and how to move on to the next thing. So it doesn't feel like you're constantly being beaten up for something that's already happened. Right? And if you do this well, it can have decisive impacts on the rest of your organization. Right? So everything from employee engagement to organizational performance, and really what this is trying to get out is adaptability sort of at scale. Right? So those are sort of my prepared remarks. What I want to do now is maybe kind of open it for conversation. We obviously have a ton of material that we could cover and talk about. I didn't spend a lot of time on the organizational or the team level. This is more geared towards the individual and the leader interaction, but happy to answer questions you guys see for.
I'm interested in your daily sync process. What's that like?
Yeah, so when what we figured out when we came back and started working with organizations was I didn't know anything about agile, by the way. I had no idea what that was going on. I was overseas, primarily fighting during when that change was become sort of foundational in the early 2000s. And when we came back and we said, what is this key lesson, and how do you create organizational adaptability? And we started synthesizing this in the systems. It was really the technology space out here in Silicon Valley that said, hey, I think we understand what you're doing. And we just use different language around it. And what they said was basically the principles of Agile, because they've been putting that into product development teams. They said, you guys just figure out how to apply this at scale to a business, right? So you guys multiple teams. And really what it was now was optimizing the internal collaboration communication systems around 3 primary continuums. So if you think about every organization, they operate in 3 areas. They do things at the strategic level, which usually has a longer time-bound planning. You do something at the operational level, which is usually around accountability, and then you have the tactical, which is your daily execution. So you have to be able to nest all 3 of those things to basically align strategy and plans with daily activities. The hardest thing to do in complexity, when things are changing fast, is to maintain alignment with the team. And so if you think about a crisis that's ever occurred, whether it be your business or something you've read about or seen in the news, what's the first thing you do when something's going really, really poorly? What do you do? What's the first thing that typically happens when all hell's breaking loose?
Blame someone.
You blame someone? After that, so you pass the blame button. Okay, fair.
You stop.
You stop, and what do you do next?
Reassess.
Reassess. My experience is typically, if you look at most crises, they set up command and control centers almost instantaneously, right? And they get everybody in, they even call it war rooms, right? They get everybody in a war room, and you start trying to figure out what the hell is going on. We don't even know what's happening because things are changing so fast. So we pull everybody in a room and we say, start sharing information. Right? So the idea is, how do you do that but on a sustainable level? If your fundamental assumption is that the world today is moving so fast that every day there's a potential crisis, how do you put yourself into a footing, almost like a fighting stance, that allows you to consistently perform to standard environments that are changing faster? The organizations that do this well have decisive advantages. Now again, this is intuitive when you're a startup, because you do this sort of naturally. Right? You're already operating fast, and usually you guys are the ones causing the disruption in the space. Right? But as you get bigger, more bureaucratic, what happens? You put processes and systems and approvals and all this bureaucracy layers in, it just grinds the thing down, right? Until the next startup comes and disrupts them again, right? So the idea is, how do you fundamentally maintain those things that you did sort of naturally when you were small, but at larger levels? And so for us, it was around how do you optimize how you communicate between really the strategy and plans with the tactical on things that created what we call shared consciousness, right? So how do I understand what's happening sort of collectively, so then I'm then empowered to make better decisions at my local level. So the way it worked for us is we did a 90-minute meeting every single day called the Ops and Intelligence Update, and we would share key learnings that were happening from across around what we called the task force, which was, again, spread off across a lot of different geographies. And it wasn't intuitive at first to me, right, because I was a relatively junior guy when I started participating in this, and I sort of watched it kind of evolve as I moved up the organization. And what I found, though, was that an appreciation for how interconnected everything was. Right? Something that was being learned in Afghanistan had application in Iraq. Something that was happening in Morocco would ultimately end up in some outcome that I was dealing with in Baghdad. And being able to connect those dots in real time and having the feel that I had to go through some bureaucracy to get it. I understood how the network worked. And I could go find a person that I needed to help me solve that problem, pull them in, collaborate them against that thing, and then adjust as needed. So we had this like almost self-organizing teams. It basically looked like this. Sorry, one second. I think I pushed too many buttons. Yeah, I did. All right, I'm going to figure it out. But what happened was, because we understood how the network was working, we could effectively leverage any part of it as we needed in the organization based on whatever the need was that was emerging. So it made us a lot more effective as an enterprise, because we could basically self-organize around stuff. So the other part that was counterintuitive is everybody on a call, in this case it was 9,000 people on this video conference every day for 90 minutes, which sounds like a lot of waste of time. But it was the most productive thing we did, because what it really stopped was all the skip level communication. Because if you think about what would happen is a leader would talk to another group of leaders, they would feel really good about whatever they just talked about. Then they would go talk to their directs, And then our organization, 9 layers down, I would get the information. I'm like, that makes no sense. We're just gonna keep doing what we're doing. So all those meetings we basically replaced with this like kind of one meeting. And the whole idea was leaders got the chance to be able to say, okay, here's the context of what's happening on the macro environment. You've identified some of these key things that are happening that we think are relevant to the rest of you. And more importantly, these are the people dealing with it. So now you can connect those dots on your own. And now get out and move at the pace you need to solve the problem. And so for me, it was about gaining those insights that gave us the information so that I can then operate much better at my level. So it took away actually a lot of meetings. And as we've seen this apply to businesses, typically what happens is it reduces overall meetings by about 30%. So you usually create some type of key to some form, you figure out what the right level is. It usually starts with whatever your plan is, or what your goals and objectives, and it sort of sinks across the multiple different teams. Sure.
How do you know the current process that you are following is working or not working?
I know it's working.
Or not working?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, funny thing you said. So, I think our first client we worked with, they were like, asked, I think that exact same question. And it was more in time of like our strategy. They had this basic thesis that they need to be much closer to the consumer on a daily basis instead of working through major channels, partners. And they felt like that was how the market dynamic was changing, was right. And they said, and they just hired like I think McKinsey or BCG or one of the big guys, and they've done this $5 million strategy for them. I was sitting on a shelf. And they're like, this looks great, but how do I operationalize this? And I'm like, I have no idea if that thing's any good or not. It's not our domain of expertise. We'll put processes in place that create feedback so that you'll learn if things are actually happening, and then you'll be able to iterate and adjust them through time. So to me, it's less about is your plan right or not. You just have to start with a known movement and start navigating. And once you start moving in direction and get the feedback mechanism happening from across your organization, then you can start to iterate effectively in real time. So that's really how the process works. It's less about what is the plan, which is more about what it should be based on the feedback you're gaining from the insights you're collecting from what's happening in the environment. It's again the same thing you're doing with like launching a product, taking feedback, collecting, but you're just doing this at scale. Sir.
I'm not sure how actual SEAL teams are created, but are there cases where all individuals on a team are trying to develop trust, but trust never develops?
Yeah, it's a great question. No, not really. Mainly because we wouldn't allow it. So, for instance, everybody goes through what's called a forging process, which they call basic underwater demolition school. It takes about 7 months. And the process from start to finish is about 18 months to produce a SEAL on to its actual team. And then from there, it's another 18 months before they go to the battlefield. So in that process, if that team is unable to gel, they'll have to go through a series of readiness and exams and tests. And if they don't pass those standards based on what you're talking about, then they would be disbanded effectively and booted out. So we wouldn't allow that because the risk is too high.
It's easy to imagine repairing trust on a small team or like on an individual basis or from day one in a big company, but what are your thoughts on, or like what are your approaches when you see lack of trust on big organizations between departments, say between like, you know, engineering and other teams?
Yeah, I think it's all around communication. I really do. I mean, typically when I see trust eroded between division departments, it's because the touch points between them are inconsistent or ineffective. And so when you pull those together around a common set of goals and objectives, and you get them aligned on what those objectives are, that's typically when you start to repair it. So for instance, for us at scale, there was zero trust between us and the CIA. Like zero, like less than zero. Like, I think they came to our meeting for the first 2 years and said no comment. Right? And then like, if we tell you something, you're going to act on it, and then my thing's going to be compromised. So no chance of giving that to the bunch of monkeys over here. Not going to happen. So it's also a bunch of like just knuckle dragging idiots, right? So there's no way they're going to share. So what we had to do is we had to go past the yard line. We had to say we're going to give you all the information we have that you will find interesting. We're going to watch you then take that, repurpose it for your own benefit, and take credit and get resources from that, and be okay with that. And at first, this again was counterintuitive, but by doing that and doing it consistently on a basis, what happened was they had to show up at our meetings and forums to get access to that information. Right? So it's kind of like Google with search, right? Like they basically said all this information's here, so you got to come here. And once you come there, now all of a sudden you can do a lot of interesting things, right? To figure out how to make money and monetize that. So for us, our version of that was sort of align them on where we want the collective organization to go. And the analogy I always give was like, I have little children, it was like a sandbox. So, you know, we built a sandbox, and the one thing we had in special operations, we had some pretty cool toys. So we put some cool toys in the sandbox every day. So anybody come play, in fact, you could take any of these toys home with you. So these different agencies would show up, and they would take a toy and they'd run away like a bad kid. But the next day they'd show up again looking for a new toy. And eventually we started changing the rules on it, right? Once they kind of get hooked, they said, all right, you need to bring a toy yourself. And over time, we started to move this thing collectively towards a common set of understanding. I don't know that we ever quite got to full trust, or even common purpose for that matter, but we did have some shared consciousness around what it is we were trying to do and what's happening. And people then felt empowered to do stuff. And usually my experience is when you put people together around a problem, they tend to figure it out, right? It's usually the bureaucracy in between that becomes the issue. So our goal was to create a forum that could skip level that bureaucracy, right? There's some mid or senior level management that was acting as a roadblock. Putting them in a room that was more open and transparent basically said you can no longer be a barrier of control for information flow. The big fundamental shift for me was this concept of knowledge is power, which is sort of how we grew up. If I know something before somebody else, I have influence on others, to this concept of sharing is power. My ability to connect and engage gives me influence and ability disproportionate to controlling information. Because what good was it if the CIA knew something that we didn't, and we were out there acting alone and afraid, right? So what would happen oftentimes when you're about to go into a target and we get a phone call saying, hey, you can't do that because the person you think is bad is actually one of our sources. And you're like, well, it's a good thing you told us because in about 10 minutes there's going to be a very different outcome to your source. So you figure out that sharing becomes the most influential thing. Sir?
John Boyd developed the OODA
Yeah, OODA.
yeah.
Yeah.
In the 70s, right?
60s, yeah.
So what went wrong?
I don't think anything went wrong. I think the principles of the OODA loop are still relevant. I just think what we had to do is figure out how to apply that at scale, right? So does anybody know what the OODA loop is? Observe, orient, decide, act. And it's basically this loop. The basic what happened was after the Korean War, the dogfighting techniques between us and the Russians were pretty good, and then it dropped off dramatically in Vietnam. And so what this guy did is he came in and said, all right, we have to teach better dogfighting tactics between airplanes. And the whole idea was if you could get inside of this decision-making loop of an individual, so that they're having to respond to you, you have a decisive advantage. Right? So it was all about picking up and speeding up and creating chaos in the moment. So the person is now trying to figure out what to do, and at that moment you have an advantage that outcomes. So it's basically what a SEAL team does every time they go into a building. Right? They say, we're going to change the game on you fundamentally, so whatever you thought was going to happen is not going to happen. And now your ability to react, we believe we can react faster than you can in that moment. Right? So all we're talking about now is how do you do that for an enterprise? How do you get in a place where, to the extent that you have competitors or competition or a marketplace that's changing fast, how do you put your organization in a place where you can orient, observe, that's basically figuring out what you want to do and what's happening, and then decide and then create actions in a time bound faster than that of your competition. Again, small organizations, startups do this really, really well, and they're basically then driving their market by responding to it. Large organizations typically are trying to respond to it. So it's all about picking up that operating cadence to be at or faster than what you think the market is. So, good.
I have a question on different levels of trust between your teammates. So you have a team and you have different levels of trust for different individuals. What's the end goal for that? Because can a team exist, or with the ideal team, is that okay to have? And should you always aim to have the same, like everyone's the highest trust? In the SEALs, you probably is required, but for us in a tech job, you're not really required to have that trust, right? Almost like if you don't have this trust required, no one says that. So what is like, from a management perspective, it would be nice to have it, but at what point do you say like, hey, I want to build this as a team member and as like a manager?
So I probably throw the question back at you, right? So would you rather work on a small team where there's high degrees of trust or low degrees of trust? Why?
More enjoyable, more effective, happier.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's the main incentive, is you feel like you can be more productive and effective in that place, right? So did everybody hear the question? So I think that's the key thing. Now the question, are you going to be the same as a Navy SEAL team? Well, I don't think that's materially relevant, to be honest. That doesn't really matter. You guys have a different objective or outcome. But I think it was said earlier, everybody wants to feel respected. Everyone wants to feel like they're connected to what they're doing, that they're valued as a person and their contribution matters, right? And so if you think about it in those terms, especially if you're in a leadership role, the whole idea is for you to establish an environment or an ecosystem with your team that fosters that, because it's going to produce better outcomes. Right? So we talked about in our book about leading like a gardener, and what we meant by that was your role as you become a leader and a manager is not to make decisions for your team, right? What do you do in Scrum when you do your stand-ups? What's your role as a Scrum Master? facilitate and remove what? Obstacles, right? It's not to say I'm going to do the work for you. It's going to say, hey, if you got an obstacle, let me see if I can get that out of your way for you so you can be more productive. Right? And by doing that, you're establishing one, empathy and understanding and creating a community where people feel valued and concerned. So I think it's that fundamental shift of like trying to establish that environment. Some of the things we talked about, we can do that. Sir?
Just curious on also diversity, but armed forces are not very well known for that diversity. Engineering has challenges there. What do you think about that space?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So the question was around what are your thoughts around diversity? And you know, and it's a question, how do you get it, or what do I think? If it's a good thing or a bad thing? What's the question? Is that?
Good thing or bad thing? Like
Yeah, good thing or bad thing. Okay, so I'll start off by giving my own experience. In the SEAL teams, we really struggle with this, right? Most SEAls sort of look like me. Maybe they got blonde hair, blue eyes, and they're white, right? So it was a real problem for us because it made us very sort of a one-trick pony, especially if you're trying to engage in multi-countries and be relevant, speak different languages. So it was something that we're constantly working on. And they still don't have it under control. When we went overseas, what we found out is we had to now operate with other groups. So all of a sudden I would take people from the State Department, or people from the NSA, or software engineers like you guys that show up on the battlefield and say, hey, I got this new gizmo or tool that helps you find bad guys better. And you go, okay, that's interesting. Not used to, in fact, I should go on target with you. And you're like, wait, what? No, that doesn't make sense. You haven't been through my 3-year selection and training process. I don't know you. There's no way you're coming on my objective with me. All that broke down by 2004 or 5, right? It had a necessity. So what I found was the diversity became the power. So I think arguably it's the most important characteristic that's needed to make any successful organization is the more diverse you are, the better chance you have of basically finding what I would call shared consciousness and be able to react effectively in any environment that you come into, right? Unless you know for certain that whatever you're going against is only going to be this one dimension, then having multiple dimensions only adds strength and value to what you're doing. So I think diversity is critical. We focus really hard at our company trying to make sure that it's inclusive, and it's not because we're feeling like we're compliant or following some social movement that we think is important. I believe it's fundamentally differentiating in the marketplace, but there's real value, sustainable value to be had from it. So anything you do to make people feel and be comfortable and try to be inclusive, you're going to get return on that investment, I promise. I'll ask one more question, and then I'll be done. Sir.
You talked about retaining trust when it's about losing trust or someone losing trust in you. Do you have any insight on retaining trust on third-party teams? Like it's your team that loses trust on some other team, or third-party teams that you gain value by them gaining trust between themselves?
So just so I understand the question, is the question how do you gain trust between third-party teams when it's been broken, or
to facilitate that process?
How do you facilitate the process? Yeah. I'm sort of a mission-oriented person just by design. I think it's kind of my background, my brain. So I find if you can basically establish a problem or an opportunity, whatever you want to call it, and you get people around the room, most people will then start focusing less on themselves and figuring out how to collectively share the gap. Right? So I spend a lot of time trying to make sure we're actually aligned and we're communicating about things that really matter collectively to the group on trying to drive towards a common goal and objective, right? And you put something out there, you start moving towards it. I find that to be the most effective thing. And when you don't do that, say, hey, I've got mine, you've got yours over there. I just don't think that's reality in today's environment anymore. Like the idea that you can have success inside of an organization and another team can fail, and that collectively it doesn't matter, I just think is been debunked. Because of all the interdependencies that exist in a system, there's just no way to know that. I mean, so if you think about this very practically from my experience on the battlefield was an 18-year-old kid can go on an objective and do something that had strategic implications, right? It could go all the way back to the President of the United States and be like, hey, this disaster just happened. They just called in an airstrike and it killed a bunch of civilians. Now all of a sudden we are shut down fundamentally from everything we're doing on the battlefield based on one decision that this kid made. Probably an innocent mistake. But the gap between like what's strategic and what's tactical, I think has been completely eroded. Everything is effectively real time now. So understanding those things basically means you understand your risk and how they interconnect, and that becomes the critical thing to making sure organizations are successful. All right, look, thanks for your time. I think I'll get some more later with you guys, but I appreciate it.